The Battle of Lexington and Concord, which took place on April 19, 1775, was the first military engagement between British soldiers and American colonial militias, marking the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. This confrontation, though small in scale, set in motion the events that would lead to the birth of a new nation. The battle itself was the result of a series of escalating tensions between the British Crown and the American colonies, which had been growing for years. The outcomes of these clashes would shape the future of the American colonies and the world at large. By the mid-18th century, the American colonies had developed their own identity and a degree of autonomy under British rule. However, the relationship between the colonies and the British government became increasingly strained after the French and Indian War, which lasted from 1754 to 1763. Britain emerged victorious but deeply in debt. In an effort to recoup some of its losses, Britain imposed a series of taxes and acts on the colonies, including the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Townshend Acts. These measures angered many colonists who felt that they were being taxed without their consent, an infringement upon their rights as Englishmen. Protests erupted throughout the colonies, with the most famous incident being the Boston Tea Party in 1773, when American colonists, disguised as Native Americans, dumped large quantities of tea into Boston Harbor to protest the Tea Act. In response, the British government passed the Coercive Acts, also known as the Intolerable Acts, which further alienated the colonists and were seen as punitive measures designed to reassert control over the colonies. By 1774, many colonists were openly discussing rebellion and independence. In September of that year, representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies met in the Continental Congress to coordinate a response to the British actions. Despite the growing discontent, the hope for a peaceful resolution remained for some time, but both sides were becoming increasingly distrustful and ready for conflict. In 1775, the British government became aware that the colonists were storing weapons and military supplies in the town of Concord, just outside of Boston. The British military, led by General Thomas Gage, saw this as a direct challenge to British authority and a potential threat to their control over the colonies. Gage's orders were clear: seize the weapons and arrest the leaders of the colonial resistance, including prominent figures such as Samuel Adams and John Hancock. On the night of April 18, 1775, Gage dispatched a force of 700 British soldiers under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith to march from Boston to Concord. Their mission was simple: to destroy the colonial munitions and capture the rebel leaders. The British hoped to achieve this without bloodshed, but they underestimated the resolve of the colonists. As the British troops began their march, colonial leaders were already preparing for the worst. One of the most famous figures associated with the events of April 19th is Paul Revere, a silversmith and member of the Sons of Liberty, a group of patriots dedicated to resisting British rule. Revere had learned of the British movement and set off on his famous midnight ride to warn the towns of Lexington and Concord of the impending danger. Revere was joined by William Dawes and Dr. Samuel Prescott in spreading the alarm. They rode through the countryside, warning militia leaders and encouraging the local militias to assemble. Revere's famous cry, "The British are coming," although likely exaggerated in folklore, became a symbol of American resolve in the face of tyranny. Revere's ride gave the colonists a crucial head start, allowing them to prepare for the arrival of the British troops. The Battle of Lexington. As dawn broke on April 19, 1775, the British soldiers reached the town of Lexington, where they encountered a group of around 70 colonial militiamen who had gathered to confront them. The British commanders demanded that the militiamen disperse. Accounts vary as to what happened next, but it is generally believed that a shot was fired, a shot that would come to be known as the shot heard round the world. The initial shot sparked a brief skirmish between the two sides. The British soldiers returned fire, and within minutes, several American militiamen lay dead or wounded. The British quickly regrouped and continued their march toward Concord. The skirmish in Lexington, while small in scale, marked the first loss of life in the conflict between the British and the colonists, the Battle of Concord. The British soldiers continued their march to Concord, where they hoped to seize the military supplies hidden by the colonial militias. However, by the time they arrived, much of the stockpile had already been moved or hidden by the colonists. The British troops found only a small amount of ammunition and supplies, leading them to begin their retreat back to Boston. During this retreat, the American militias began to assemble in greater numbers. Armed with muskets and determined to defend their homes, the colonists began to harass the British troops, firing at them from behind trees, stone walls and buildings. The British soldiers, who were unaccustomed to such irregular warfare, found themselves under constant attack. The Americans, on the other hand, had the advantage of knowing the terrain and were able to inflict significant casualties. By the time the British forces reached the safety of the fortified city of Boston, they had suffered a total of 273 casualties, including 73 dead. The colonial militias, on the other hand, lost only around 90 men, but their victory was a significant one in terms of morale and military momentum. The American forces had demonstrated their ability to stand up to the British military, and they had shown that they were willing to fight for their rights and freedoms. The events of April 19, 1775, set the stage for the larger conflict that would follow. Within days, the news of the battle spread throughout the colonies, and the American militias began to mobilize in greater numbers. The British had underestimated the resolve of the colonists, and the Americans had demonstrated that they were ready to resist British rule by force, if necessary. In the wake of the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the Continental Congress convened once again and began to take steps toward organizing a unified resistance against British authority. The colonies began to send reinforcements to Boston, where the British were now besieged by colonial militias. The confrontation between the British and the American colonists would soon escalate into a full-blown war, with battles fought at places like Bunker Hill, Saratoga, and Yorktown. Eventually, after 8 years of conflict, the United States of America would emerge as an independent nation. The Battle of Lexington and Concord is remembered as the moment when the American colonies took the first step toward independence. It demonstrated that the colonists were willing to fight for their rights and freedoms, and it provided the spark that ignited the flames of revolution. While the battle itself was small and limited in scope, its significance cannot be overstated. It was the beginning of a new chapter in American history, one that would lead to the formation of a republic founded on the principles of liberty and self-governance. The Battle of Lexington and Concord was a pivotal moment in the history of the United States. It was the first battle of the American Revolutionary War, and it marked the beginning of a long and difficult struggle for independence. The battle was not only a military confrontation, but also a symbol of the determination and resilience of the American people. The events of April 19, 1775, demonstrated the willingness of the colonists to stand up against what they saw as unjust British rule, and it sparked a revolutionary movement that would eventually lead to the establishment of the United States. The legacy of the Battle of Lexington and Concord endures to this day. It reminds us of the sacrifices made by those who fought for freedom and the principles of self-determination. The shot heard round the world may have been fired in a small town on the outskirts of Boston, but its echoes reverberated across the globe, inspiring revolutions and movements for liberty in countries around the world. In the end, the Battle of Lexington and Concord was more than just a skirmish between armed forces. It was the birth of a nation. Please like and subscribe for more content like this.